When the great J.P. Morgan was asked what the markets will do, he answered that he thought they will fluctuate. That's about all you can forecast. But I can tell you that the outlook for the investment industry and the place of finance in our society, I think, will continue on a secular trend. I think the outlook for finance and for investment in general is very good indeed. I think the financial sector will continue to expand beyond this short period of the crisis. Again, perhaps one day, without a doubt, they have the populations, as we know, for very large economies. If the capital formation that we've seen in China over the past decade and more continues, then without a doubt there will be a very large pool of capital in Asia, and therefore that will be reflected in the stock exchanges. So it could very well be that Shanghai and Mumbai take the lead in terms of the world financial sector, but certainly I think they will compete with London and New York in the years to come. I think it will be a global century. I think less and less, it will matter less and less whether you're an Indian, Chinese, or those economies. The economies around the world are becoming so integrated. So many companies are becoming multinationals and truly global companies. It's very difficult to say whether it's a Chinese or an Indian company. So for example...
This was an American century.
Sorry?
This was an American century.
It was in the past, yes, when the economies and the markets were very divided. But I think all of that is changing. For example, take the oil company BP. Many Americans think that it's a British company, and sure enough, its history is British. But if you look at its assets, where they're making money, where they're invested and so on, it's around the world. You know, it's a global company that happens to have a history in the UK, and I think the world is going to become more and more like that. I don't think you can characterize it as an Indian or a Chinese century. I think the trend for globalization will continue, and that will be a much more important trend than whether the China or India leads it. I remain optimistic for both. I think the euro and the underlying economic experiment, if you like, at integrating European markets is a bold experiment. I think so far it has been successful. I know there are near-term challenges right now with the fiscal deficit, but I think we'll get through that. I think the euro is a common currency for many nations in Europe will survive, and I think Europe also has a bright future in the decades to come. Well, I think the genesis of the crisis of the last few years was really about excessive leverage being built up in the financial system, and perhaps not enough attention being paid to risk management. And ultimately, the rising leverage turned into greater and greater risk until the crisis happened. In very broad terms, that's probably a good characterization of the crisis. Now, can we preempt a crisis in the future? I doubt if we can avoid all crises in the future. These things happen on a regular basis. There are many factors usually behind any particular crisis. However, with all the changes in the regulatory architecture that are being planned now in Europe, in North America, I think we're reducing the probability of a future crisis. I think the steps being taken around the world under a G20 framework certainly give me greater hope that we may do much to actually reduce the chances of a crisis. Specifically, the banking system will require a lot more capital that will act as a buffer. A lot of the ways in which leverage was built up will be now much more transparent. Regulators will be able to monitor the systemic risk on a pan-European basis for Europe, for example, and even in the US, there has been a consolidation of the regulatory architecture as well, which means that regulators will be in a much better position to actually preempt a crisis like this. So I think the changes that we've seen as a result of the financial crisis will do much to try and avoid the next one. But I doubt if we can get rid of crisis forever. Well, I can tell you the role that we're playing in the aftermath of the present crisis. First of all, we're making sure that we deliver on our mission, which is to raise standards for ethics, education, and professional excellence within finance and the investment profession. So we'll continue to do that. I think the world needs a greater emphasis on professionalism, and as an association of investment professionals, that's what we're trying to attempt. On top of that general mission, we are also working and engaging with regulators around the world to better inform them of the investors' perspectives. Our members are investors around the world, and we're making sure that the investors' voice is heard in the formulation process for future regulation.